Day of Pentecost came. They were all together in one place. And suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. And they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. And when they heard the sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said, "They have had too much wine." Then Peter stood up. That's enough. Then Peter stood up. Be seated in the presence of the Lord for just a minute if you can. Thank you, praise team. Family, I just got a real quick word for you on Pentecost Sunday. I want to talk about the power to stand up. The power to stand up. I want you to look at the text with me real quick again. Verse 1 says that when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place, just like we are right now. And suddenly a sound like the blowing of violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house while they were sitting. Verse 5 says, now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. And when they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all of these people speaking Galileans?" They asked themselves that question for a reason. They asked themselves that question because Galileans had a bit of a reputation. You know, like some of us in the room, they had a little bit of a reputation. Galileans were from Nazareth. Nazareth was a part of town that was considered the wrong side of the tracks. People looked down on Galileans as poor and uneducated. They treated them like they were less than. Even Jesus' disciple Nathanael in John chapter 1, 45 to 46, when he was still sitting under the fig tree before he accepted Jesus' invitation to be a disciple, Philip had just walked up to him and said, we've found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" See, these Nazarene Galileans, they had a bit of a reputation because they were considered to be pretty much the low end of the spectrum. And what was worse, Galileans, they had an accent. People generally saw them coming, but if you happened to miss their look, you could tell immediately when they started talking they had an accent. That's why when the crowd heard this new gospel message being declared so eloquently and with such power and such conviction and in their own languages, they said to themselves, "Aren't all of these people speaking Galileans? How is it that each of them is able to do such a thing? How are they able to declare the gospel message that we've never heard before with such authority and such clarity? And how in the world are all of us who are from different nations and regions from all over the world, how are we each able to hear their message in our own tongue? Verse 13 says, some on the crowd, maybe out of pure shock, maybe out of fear, maybe out of skepticism, some of the crowd started making fun of the disciples, saying they've had too much wine. Now it was only 9 a.m. Peter would reveal to us in a couple of verses. It's a little early for adult beverages. But perhaps in that moment, that was the only thing this crowd could think of that would explain what they were witnessing. Somebody's got to be drunk. I ain't seen this kind of behavior before. Maybe it was the only thing they could fathom that would allow their assumptions and their biases to remain intact. Maybe it was the only thing they could think of that would keep them anchored in their sense of normalcy and control. So they wrote off this completely abnormal scene, this powerful scene that just occurred in front of them. They wrote it off as just a bunch of drunk people, 120 drunk people, just declaring this message in different languages that they could understand. They just wrote it off. Just another day in Jerusalem, I guess. But then, family, out of absolutely nowhere, something happened. Something happened that has been happening every single day since. Something happened that became the literal turning point for the rest of history as we know it. Something happened upon which untold lives have been transformed and countless stories rewritten. What happened, Pastor? The Spirit gave somebody the power to stand up. We don't just come into this place for goosebumps. We come to receive the power to stand up. God has given us the power to stand up. Look at verse 12. Amazed and perplexed, the crowd asked one another, what does this mean? And somebody in the world, your neighbor, your co-worker, your schoolmate, somebody right now is asking, what does all of this that I'm seeing mean? What does this mean? Some however, made fun of them and said they've had too much wine. But then, verse 14, Peter stood up. Family, Pentecost is the story of the day that the Spirit of the living God stood up in the world, and he did so through a man named Peter. That's all Pentecost. Somebody asked me this morning, what is Pentecost? It's the day the Spirit stood up in Peter, and the church came into being. Isn't that interesting? At Pentecost, the Holy Spirit stood up and empowered Peter to stand up. That's the same Peter who was almost too insecure and stubborn to get back in his boat and let down his net. That same Peter who was so violent that he pulled out a knife and cut off a soldier's ear trying to save Jesus from his assignment. Same Peter. It's the same Peter who was so angry and short-tempered that he cursed out a woman because she outed him as Jesus' disciple. Same Peter. It was the same Peter who was so cowardly that he denied even knowing his Savior moments before a cock started crowing. The same Peter who had so little resilience that he decided to quit being a disciple and go back to fishing. That Peter, after fire falls on him at Pentecost, after the Spirit of the living God came into his life like a mighty rushing wind, that same Peter, as unlikely a candidate as he was, he found himself with the power to stand up. What's all of this for? Is it so that we can be in a social club called Christianity? Is it so that we can do all the things together? Is it just so that we can come and worship? No, all of this is because God has called us to stand up. It's not just Peter's story. That's my story. That's your story. It's our story. Pentecost is the story of what still happens when God empowers people just as unlikely as Peter was, just as unworthy, sometimes just as unwilling. But when Pentecost happens in your life, you will find yourself with the power to stand up. power to stand up into your calling, power to stand up into your purpose, power to stand up into your assignment, power to stand up into your joy and into your peace and into your strength and into your forgiveness. Just like Peter, the Spirit of the living God has given us power to stand up. Pentecost is the story of the Spirit empowering a people to stand up and become His church. That's what we celebrate today. Now we understand that the Pentecost, from a historical standpoint, Pentecost, it was just a festival. It was a festival. The Jews called it the Feast of Weeks. Shavuot was the festival. It was one of the three major pilgrimage feasts on the Jewish calendar. So every year, faithful Jews from all over the known world would journey to Jerusalem to worship. Sometime 50 days or so after Passover, they would come to Jerusalem to worship at Pentecost, at Shavuot. But family, don't miss the strategy of God in this moment. God's strategic. Don't miss it. Acts 2. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't coincidence. God waited until Jerusalem was overflowing with people from every direction of the known world before He poured out His Spirit. He was waiting. Verse 5 says, there were God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. Do you see what He did? After Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead, for 40 days He appeared to His disciples. 40 days. Jesus was crucified and got up, and for 40 days he's appearing to His disciples. He's teaching them. He's proving to them that He was alive. He's letting them put their hands in His side and touch the nail prints in His hand. 40 days, and as he was preparing to ascend into heaven to be with His Father, He told His disciples, now I'm about to go, but I want you, don't leave Jerusalem. He was very specific. He said, you can't do what I've got you. You can't stand up unless you wait. You can't do what I've called you to do unless you wait. Don't leave Jerusalem until I give you my gift. Don't go anywhere until the promise of the Father has come to you. See, then Jesus, He ascended into heaven, and His disciples, they just waited. They waited in Jerusalem for what they did not know. They just knew it was a gift. For how long, they had no clue. They were just waiting. Some of y'all feel like that's your life right now. You don't know what it is. You don't know when it's going to come. You're just waiting. That's what they were doing in Jerusalem, just waiting. They would know it when they saw it. They were just waiting. And about 10 days later, during Shavuot, after the 40 days, 10 days later, during the Feast of Weeks, during Shavuot, 50 days after Passover, roughly 120 believers were gathered together praying, and on one accord, and the Spirit of God fell like a mighty rushing wind. Just filled up the room, burst into time and space, shook them to their core. Scripture says something that appeared to be tongues of fire came down and separated and rested above each of their heads. Spirit fell. Now understand, because it was Shavuot, because it was the Feast of Weeks, because it was Pentecost, Jerusalem had become, for at least a few days, it was an international gathering point right there in Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem was filled to the brim with Jews, God-fearing Jews who had traveled home from all over the known world to celebrate the festival, which they were required to do by Mosaic law. So they'd come from all over the world, and as you might expect, they were an extremely diverse bunch. There were Jews who had been born in Rome and were Jewish, Jews who had been reared in Egypt. You had some who'd been educated in Asia, some who were living in Mesopotamia. There, some were trading and doing business in Arabia. Some were Greek-speaking, some were Latin-speaking, some were Aramaic-speaking. Some speaking the language or the dialect of their home countries. Some had traveled hundreds of miles. Some had crossed deserts. Some had sailed seas. Some had spent weeks trying to get to Jerusalem for worship. And God, in His strategic foresight, He says, this is the moment I'm going to release the gift. Shavuot, this is the moment I'm going to send my Spirit. Listen, can I help somebody here? Just as a side note, let me help you with something. God has always known how to choose the right moment for you to. Your life is not random. You're not just going through stuff for the sake of going through it. He has a moment. He's strategic with your life. Just like he was right here in Jerusalem. He had a plan. God, he's always known how to choose the right moment for the thing to happen. God chose the perfect moment for Pentecost because what looked like a chaotic crowd to some people, it was actually a strategy for God. What looked like a loud festival was actually a launch party. What looked like a weekend worship experience was actually the beginning of a global movement. That's why Acts 1, 9 through 11, it gives this long list of nations represented in the crowd that confronted Peter and the disciples after hearing this loud noise. You had Parthians, you had Medes, you had Elamites, Mesopotamians, Cappadocians, you had Pontus, people from Asia, Egypt, Libya, Rome, Crete, Arabia. You had folks from all over the place. And at first glance, it just feels like a long list of hard to pronounce names. But look, the writer here, Luke, he's trying to show us something. He's trying to show us something. He's trying to show us that the gospel was never supposed to stay in Jerusalem. Even in the text, God was already preparing to send the gospel to the nations, to the north, to the south, to the east, and the west. It's right here in the text. Look, in the passage, the Parthians and the Medes, the Elamites, the residents of Mesopotamia, those were all regions and countries that were to the east of Jerusalem. Not only that, but they were regions connected to ancient Babylon and Persia, places where Jews had lived ever since the exile in the Old Testament generations earlier. In other words, folks standing right there in that very crowd, wondering what all the noise was about. Some of them were about to hear Peter's sermon, get saved, and then carry the gospel back home to Babylon and Persia, of all places, empires that were historically the home of the Jewish captivity. And they were going to become free by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then generations later, keep rolling the tape. Generations later, the same seed of revival would keep spreading down through trade routes in that area and over deserts and eventually even along the Silk Road. And we have historical evidence that it would give rise to ancient Christian traditions like the Syriac church. The Syriac church is one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, and eventually that's the seed from that same group of people right there at Pentecost. It would travel into Asia and even into India, where ancient Christian communities still exist to this very day. So when Peter looked at the crowd, whether he realized it then or not, he was looking at the Spirit's strategy to win the East for Jesus. But not only that, when Peter looked at the crowd, he wasn't just looking at the east, he was looking at the north. Cappadocia, Pontus, Phrygia, that's Asia Minor, that's modern-day Turkey, that's to the north of Jerusalem. And out of that region would emerge some of the most influential churches and theologians in Christian history, churches that just a few chapters later in the book of Acts, we already see Paul evangelizing. Ephesus and Galatia and Colossae, the 7 churches of Revelation, standing in that very crowd were people who would be a part of the Spirit's strategy to win the north for Jesus. Same crowd. And then there's the south. Don't sleep on the south. Egypt, Libya, Cyrene. They was in the crowd too. Don't miss Africa in the text. I need somebody to hear me say, Christianity did not arrive in Africa late. Africa was there at the beginning. I need to say that. I need to say that for y'all to hear me, because somebody tried to convince us that Christianity is, quote unquote, the white man's religion, whatever that means. It was force-fed to African slaves on southern plantations. That's the argument. I understand the sentiment. I understand where that comes from, but respectfully, the historical record tells a very different story, y'all. Respectfully. Because long before the evil of racism and colonialism and all of that stuff, slavery had metastasized in the American South, the Christian church in Africa had already been changing the world for Jesus for literal generations. Long before plantations. You can see it right there in the text and throughout church history if you pick up a book. Africa was at Pentecost too. Egypt, Libya, Cyrene, they were all present and accounted for. And you best believe when these new converts would eventually go back home after hearing Peter's sermon, they would go on to plant seeds of revival that would drive the entire course of Christian history. Family, did you not know that out of Africa would eventually emerge some of the earliest and most influential Christian thinkers and church fathers in all of church history? They were from Africa. Athanasius of Alexandria. He lived from 293 to 373 AD. He was an Egyptian theologian and Christian bishop who would eventually become one of the greatest Christian scholars and shapers and defenders of the doctrine of the Trinity. That was Athanasius. Around the 4th century, there was a struggle going on in the church. They were trying to figure it out, and it was a near split over a controversial false teaching called Arianism. Arianism was a teaching that sought to diminish the stature of Jesus. It sought to treat Jesus as less than fully divine, as if he was a created being. And it was Athanasius who argued at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, divine in his own nature and not a created being. He was from the South. Augustine of Hippo, just give me a minute. Augustine of Hippo, he was a North African bishop from what is now modern-day Algeria in Africa. Augustine, he was a powerful preacher. He was a theologian. He was a prolific writer and thinker who authored theological works like the Confessions and the City of God. You can pick them up at your library. That was Augustine of Hippo. And he was from Africa. Origen of Alexandria. He was one of the most important biblical scholars and theologians of the early church period. He lived from 185 to 254 AD. He produced a massive work of theology comparing versions of the Old Testament. It's called the Hexapla. That was Origen of Alexandria. Then there was Clement. I could go on for a minute. There was Anthony the Great. There was the Desert Fathers. I could go on regarding African voices that would eventually spring up as harvest from the very seeds that we see planted out of Acts chapter 2. They went home and they told about the gospel. And we are benefiting from what happened there even today. So when Peter looked at the crowd, he saw people from the north. He saw people from the south. He saw people from the east. And even the west. It says, Acts 2:10 says there were also visitors from Rome. Rome was to the west, the political center of the known world, the seat of power, of empire, of influence. Even Rome would one day see the seeds of the gospel at work inside of its gates, all coming from Acts chapter 2. Family, Pentecost was no accident. It was strategic. God was about to launch his church at the exact moment when all of the right ingredients were in place and in their respective places. But understand, family, the spark that ignited a gospel explosion, the trigger that changed everything, it came after a man named Peter. Insecure, angry, short-tempered, violent, cowardly Peter, empowered by the Holy Spirit, stopped running and stopped shrinking back and stopped giving up on God and stopped sitting silent, and he finally stood up. Family, tell me, what's on the other side of your decision to stand up? What's God gonna do when you finally decide that you want the Spirit to stand up in you so you can stand up in your own life? What's going to happen when you stop apologizing for your own life and your own conviction and the voice that's inside of you? What's going to happen when you stop trying to shirk your responsibility and shirk your calling and your purpose? What's going to happen on the other side of your obedience? What's going to happen on the other side of your decision to stand up? Not in and of yourself, but by the power of the only living God. Verse 12 says, amazed and perplexed, They asked one another, what does this mean? Some, however, made fun of them and said they have had too much wine. And then Peter stood up with the 11. He raised his voice and he addressed the crowd. Fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. He said, I need to talk to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 in the morning. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. Joel said, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. Family, you might look at that and think that's a great story, but Joel wasn't talking about me. You might say that's an awesome climax to the sermon, Pastor, but Peter, he isn't referring to myself. I'm too broken. I'm too afraid. I'm too unqualified. I've failed too many times. I'm too old. I'm too young. I'm too black. I'm too white. I'm too inconsistent. I'm too flaky. Whatever your I'm too is. I hear you. But I just need to gently remind us that Jesus isn't interested in your I'm too. Needs you to understand. What God requires and expects out of us in this season does not compare about or acknowledge your excuses. I just need to tell you like a TI is. He's got too much strategy at play to let I'm too win the day. He's got too much on the other side of your standing up to let you take too long to do it. In fact, Pentecost proves that when the Spirit gets involved, our limitations no longer get the final say anyway. I mean, when the Spirit's really involved, it doesn't acknowledge our limitations anyway. Family, if the Spirit could stand up in Peter, he'll stand up in you. If the Spirit was willing to stand up in Peter, he will stand up in me too. Pentecost is a story of what happens when God puts his Spirit inside ordinary people and then has his power stand up in them. Because real power isn't born out of perfection anyway. Real power is not born out of perfection. It isn't born out of eloquence. It isn't born out of gifts. It isn't born out of feeling of readiness or preparedness to do whatever God has called you to do. Real power is born out of surrender. Surrender. That's it. Your only superpower is surrender. That's the key that unlocks the door in your life. Every door that God has placed in front of you, what unlocks the door is your surrender. Are you willing to surrender to him in this season? Are you willing to stand up and be his church when life keeps trying to make you sit down? Are you willing to stand up and be his church when you really just want to run and hide? Are you willing to stand up and be his church when circumstances make you want to quit, when life is so heavy you feel like your legs are going to buckle and your arms are going to give out? Will you stand up anyway? Because family, in those moments, I just want to remind you that you are his church and you do have the power to stand up. I mean, in your own life, you have the power to, you are not a victim of anything. You have the power and the call to stand up. No matter what life throws your way, no matter how the battle rages, no matter how long the midnight, no matter how crazy the obstacle, you have the power to stand up in the middle of all of that. And when you do, he says to you, you will be my witnesses. That's the whole thing. When you stand up, you'll find yourself his witness. You will be my witness, he says, in Judea. That's at home. You'll be my witness in Samaria. That's in town. And then you'll be my witnesses in the uttermost parts of the world. That's wherever you got to go. When you stand up, you will be his witness. He will use you. He will work through you. He will stand up in you. You will be his witness. When you stand up, you'll tell a dying world that there is a balm in Gilead who makes the wounded whole. You'll be his witness. When you stand up, you'll show broken people that grace still works. When you stand up, you'll prove that failure is not final when the Spirit gets involved. When you stand up, you'll become living proof that Jesus still saves. Jesus still works. Jesus still heals. He still delivers. He still sets free. He still changes mind. He still restores relationships. He still meets needs. He still covers less. You'll be his witness when you stand up. And the good thing is, you got the power to do it. You've already been waiting, but you got the power. That's what happened in Pentecost. It only needed to happen once. The church waited for you, so you ain't got to wait. Peter, the 11, the 120, they waited so you wouldn't have to wait. When the Spirit came, he stayed. He ain't left since Acts 2. He's been here, giving people power, giving the church the ability to stand up. He ain't gone nowhere. He hasn't slept or slumbered. He hasn't been confused or distracted. He's been giving power. This whole time, he gave it in the north, he gave it in the south, he gave it in the east, he gave it in the west, he'll give it today, he'll give it tomorrow. He's giving you power to stand up. He's giving you power to stand up in your mind and stand up against your depression and stand up against your anxiety. He'll give you power to stand up against problems and distraction and addiction. He'll give you power to stand up right now. That's the gift of Pentecost. The power to stand up. I want you to stand on your feet right now.